Good morning, everybody. Today, I will give a lecture on the explanation of the 6 crises in China. That is the 1980s. And we are trying to give more detailed explanation about the economic system reform. Most of these people, both inside and outside, knows that China started the economic reform since the late 1970s, the early 1980s. Last time, we have gave the background and analysis to tell people that the economic systematic reform is exactly caused by the crisis, the 5th crisis, happened in late 1970s and the early 1980s. Is that it's caused by large amount of the foreign capital flow into China in 1970s because at that time China reset up the diplomatic relation with Western society, with Western countries. And now this time we are trying to give a more explanation about the background. Why that China, since 1980s, China can accelerate the economic reform and also to have so-called high growth since 1980s. The first, we must notice that the 1980s is that it's a new historical era in name of Neoliberalism. If you have the picture, we have the picture to show that originally since the 1960s, caused by the excess industrial capital expands in 1960s, but most of that time, most of these countries set up the independence after the Second World War, still be very poor. So when Western society, Western countries, they re-industrialization after the Second World War, they can produce large amount of industrial goods, but there's no market. So from 1960s, most of these industrialized country falling into the social chaos, and a lot of left-wing movements encouraged by Maoism in Western society became very serious. And many thousands of people joined the social movements. And until 1980s, you can see that it's very clear to show that what is the historical difference. 1960s, every decade, every year, the foodist and kerosene production as a model declined. So that mass production is a kind of typical foodism for the industrialization, for the industrial capital expansion. But from 1960 to 1970s, they cannot create the capital accumulation. So downgrade every year until 1980s. And 1980s is very important because that the 1970s, late 1970s and early 1980s, when China is the biggest country, biggest population country, and also the biggest market country, its biggest market size, started to absorb these Western countries' surplus industrial capital. It's immediately turned to a new phenomenon. That is here, you can see that the real production downgrade every year, but the overseas capital returns increased since 1980s, 1970s, 1980s. And before 1980s, and most of these Western countries only transfer out their manufacturing industries to so-called 4 small dragon and 4 small tigers. But these country and the region mainly allocated at the peninsula or islands. So the geographical size is small, and the population size also small. So they cannot absorb too much surplus industrial capitals. So just started from this small economy. But when China opened to Western countries, when China re-set up the diplomatic relation with Western countries, it's very important because China is a big mainland country. So that is why from 1970s to 1980s, especially from the 1980s, this American industrial capital can have a more overseas interest from overseas investments. So we go back to this one. So that is also to show that the accumulation since 1980s increased very fast. And then most of these overseas investments created large number of the overseas returns flow back to Western countries, especially flow back to United States, mainly flow into the stock market, join the speculations. So from 1980s, that is a new liberalism applied to financial capital grow up. So industrial capital declined, and then financial capital increased. So decreased and increased to make the Western capital system, Western capitalist system, have a very big change. A new era, we said, is global financialization, started from 1980s, combining by the new liberalism. That is a very important background to understand what is developing countries grow up. Because that the industrial capital not as a originally, not as a past, is a play very important role. Since 1980s, financial capital play a leading role. That is we need to talk about the background. So first, we must know that it's a new era. Financial capital leading the Western society grow up of their accumulation caused by they transfer out their industrial capital to developing countries, and then have a large number of the overseas return, and then this overseas return can be very strong force into the stock market, financial market. So they financialized their economy and transfer out their physical production, turn to the financial capital era. That is a very critical background. And because of that time, there's a big change in Western countries. So most of these Western countries mainly taking the revenue, taking the profit from the financial capital grow up. And because of China regained the diplomatic relation with Western countries, these industrialized country, these advanced country, joined competition to joint competition of the China industrial market, mainly for transfer the facilities to machines to China. And then it make the chance, means that the traditional Chinese industrial structure got a chance to restructure. But restructure the heavy industry, machinery industry, and the military industry still need to pay intensive capital investments. It means that the institutional cost still be very high. And also there is a very important event, that is Japan. You know, in 1970s when China set up the diplomatic relation with Japan, China don't want Japan pay the penalty of the Second World War. So, and Japan to be the return and raise up to give the official aid loans and also the technological facilities for facilitate China industrial development. And that is the interest rate in 1970s, 1980s in China. Most of these loans is more than 10% of annual interest rate. But Japan gave China the interest rate is just less than 3%. And also the return period can be 30 years. So it means a long-term loan, very low interest rate. It benefits this China a lot, because at that time China still be the country very much shortage of the capital investments. So Japan gave China large amount of the official investments from the governments. That is a very positive events for 1980s restructuring the national economy, restructuring the national industry structure. But most of the first 3 years, the first period of Japanese aid China large amount of loans, mainly 50% need to buy Japanese facilities. That is means that Japan buy governments give loans to China. Japan sell a lot of facilities, machines to China to occupy the China's machinery market. And then there is another very important event in 1980s because of the so-called second land reform taking place in the beginning of 1980s. Most of these rural areas households, the peasants' households, take back their arable land. And then there are many surplus labor force released from the collective system. Originally, these Chinese rural labor organized by the collective system mainly invest into the reservoir irrigation system and also invested into state big infrastructure construction. But from the 1980s, the governments could hardly to organize the labor force to invest into the national construction. So the labor force separated to almost every household, immediately to show that the rural labor is a big surplus. And then this a big surplus, you know that if you calculate of the whole of the arable land, China only need 100 million. The rural labor is enough. But from 1980s, when rural reform finished, you find that there is almost 200 million to 300 million surplus labor in the countryside. So this a big surplus labor because it's big surplus. So the labor price is very cheap. They started to run their own workshop and factories in the countryside. So township and village enterprises grow up. Rural industrialization, mainly by this surplus labor, invest into their own labor force for the rural industry. So that is very important because of the local industrialization mainly rely on the rural industrialization. So the beginning of 1980s, rural industrialization is indeed local industrialization. So, but take this events into the consideration, we may know that why China can gain the high growth, because large number of the surplus rural labor run into the local industrialization. They got very little income, and a large amount of the interest taken by the local industry, and then to be the accumulation. That is just several years. The rural industrialization became more and more important to grow up faster. So we should know that caused by the rural labor, the labor-intensive overseas demand manufacturing industries grow up in the coastal China. But another side is also very critical. Because of all the rural collective system, almost all of them dismissed. So the People's Commune dismissed, Brigade dismissed. So the agricultural production taken by these small households. And small households doesn't need the agricultural machine. So before 1980s, China has set up almost 3,000 county levels agricultural machines factory. Every People's Commune, China has set up 5 small factories at People's Commune. So these are 2 levels. People's Commune change into the township level, and the county level still the county. These are 2 levels agricultural machinery system almost bankrupted. So means that from 1950s, China invested into the local industries, mainly for facilitated agricultural production. But after rural reform, after these households regain the land, they don't need this machine work in agriculture. So the county level and the township levels machinery factory almost bankrupted because no market. And think about the industrial as a chain. When the county levels machinery factory bankrupted, certainly the upper level, like the heavy industries, mine industries, and so on and so, all have a very bad impact. So this is a kind of negative change. I mean, when the local factories bankrupted, and the upper one, even in the cities, these are big industrial factories also need to facing very negative situation. So these are the events of the 1980s reform. And we have given explanation about these things. That's what means that the Japanese aid China from 1979 to 2012, Japan gave the official development assistance ODA to China, and it's almost 60% of that time's overseas aid, overseas assistance loans. So most of these loans, these are Japanese loans, invest into the infrastructure construction. And the first 3 years, mainly by Japanese machines and Japanese facilities, and later, mainly invest into the infrastructure construction. And infrastructure construction cannot have the return in short term. So Japanese development assistance loan became very important because it's mainly invested into the infrastructure construction. And also, because of this loan, mainly invest into the infrastructure construction, means that Chinese governments need every year to have such kind of assistance loan and then to pay back to other countries. When you take the facilities from Western countries, you also need to have a long term to have a returns and not short term. So this means every year Chinese governments have a large amount of the foreign debts. And then foreign debts to GDP, especially the short-term foreign debts to GDP, is very high. So if you cannot have a kind of sustainable foreign aid, immediately Chinese governments will facing the challenge of the budget deficit. So that is why we give one page to show that Japanese official assistant loan, official development assistant loan, is at that time play a very important role in 1980s. But one thing is somehow turn to the risk, because ODA, mean the official development assistant, and give to China, calculated by dollar. When China paid it back, it started from 1970s. China paid it back, started from the new century. When they pay back, they must give to the Japanese yen. And Japanese yen is somehow the convertible rate, Japanese yen is increased. So means that China payback need to have a more cost. So that is a risk. But most of this Japanese official assistance loan to China is a benefits 1980s Chinese infrastructure construction. And the cost by these foreign aid and foreign investments caused by the large amount of foreign capital flow into China, mainly taken by the central governments. So the central still maintain their traditional policy to use the foreign capital, the foreign loans, to restructure the traditional industrial structure. Means that since 1950s, when Soviet Union gave the facilities to China, that is mainly given to military industry and heavy industries. So this heavy industry, military industry, I have given the explanation, you need even double cost to maintain. Nowadays, Chinese want to restructure the industrial system, and then to develop more light industries and textile industries and chemical industries. But until 1970s, this purpose never been carried out because of the geopolitics, because of they facing a lot of political challenge until late 70s to early 80s. So this time, I mean, Chinese central governments still maintain their policy to change the structure of industries and to make the light industry and the textile industries grow up. That is, they need more capital invest, and then they can carry out their purpose. So for this one, they need to take the cost. The big cost is that it's a capital intensive readjustment, and also caused by the local industrialization, mainly invested by overseas Chinese company. This overseas Chinese company invest into the coastal area, that they have the facilities, machines from overseas, also the markets in overseas. So they don't set up any relation with the inland industries. It means that inland industry, especially national industries, have no markets. There's no relation as a market between central controlled national industrial capital and local governments overseas manufacturing industries. I think that people need to pay attention to this relation cut-off. Originally, the local industry only can be facilitated by the central industrial capital. Central control the machinery industry, control the heavy industries, and central can produce a lot of machines to the local. If any local want to develop their local industries, they need to have the machines from central. But nowadays, since 1980s, because China, especially the coastal area, absorb a lot of manufacturing industries from overseas Chinese investments. They move the machines from overseas, and also the products sell to the overseas. So it means that such kind of industries allocated in the coastal area have no relation with the national industries inside of mainland China. This one is extremely important. Just like I mentioned that when the agriculture separated by the households, they don't need agriculture machine. So this national agricultural machinery system bankrupted. The similar regulation, economic regulation, if the overseas manufacturing industries didn't need the facilities from the national industries, especially the national heavy industries and the machinery industries, means that the national heavy industry and the machinery industry also have no market. So they fall into the trap. Means the more you absorb this foreign capital in overseas, from overseas, allocated in the coastal area, so the booming economy grow up in the coastal area. The more overseas investment in the coastal area, the less market of the national industries. Originally, you paid very high cost to maintain the Soviet Union invested heavy industry and military industry. Finally, you found, okay, you have no market. Nowhere need you produce machines to these overseas market needs. So that is when the central take a lot of foreign capital trying to restructuring their state industrial capital system. Finally, they paid high cost, but finally they found there's no market. That is a central central industries, the trap of central industries. And then local. And the local, because of in the beginning of 1980s, the Chinese have a kind of very important change. Originally, they trying to have a balance of the regional development. So that 1960s and 1970s, they transfer a lot of industries from coastal area into the inland, into the West China. That is the so-called the third frontier construction. Paid almost 260 billion Chinese yuan. It's large payments for move the coastal industries into the inland China. It's almost paid 20 years. But this time, they set up a new theory for development. That is a floor development. Means step by step. You need to first develop this coastal area, these are provinces. And then when they become rich, and then they can facilitate inland provinces. So they said, allow some areas rich before others. That is a kind of new strategy for 1980s development. So because of this strategy, and the local have a big difference. The regional gap enlarged. The coastal China have a lot of foreign investments for manufacturing industries, for overseas export, for exports to overseas, means that they have a strong relation with the overseas markets, but no strong relation with the inland markets. They only need cheap labor and raw materials. Sometimes, or some area, they even doesn't need the materials in local. They can input the materials from overseas and then sell their products to the overseas. So it means that the coastal areas, that is, became more and more economically independent. Strong relation with overseas, less relation with inland. So that means there's a local industrialization, mainly focused on the overseas markets. But China have a traditional geographical line. From Heilongjiang, there is a county in name of Aihui, and down to the south, Yunnan province, there is a county in name of Teijun. So you can draw a line from Aihui to Teijun. That is the line of east and west in China. So 70% of the capital allocated in the east, 70% of the natural resources allocated in the west. So the capital intensive in the coastal area, and then natural resources allocated in the west. So that means that these are coastal area, I mean the east part of China, take the mine, take the coal and a lot of resources for the coastal area development, and also for foreign market, for overseas market. Means that China is originally a kind of very short natural resources country, a very limited natural resources taken by the coastal area for overseas markets. That means the gap between east and west, not only the economic gap, but also the natural resources gap, means that you cannot use your own limited natural resources to benefit your own people. So these things, these phenomena, taking place in 1980s because that you need to develop these coastal provinces caused by you set up a new theory of the development, means step by step. And these superficially you can see that China grew up in 1980s very faster. But if you deepen your studies into the Chinese development, you can find there are so many contradictions in 1980s. And also there's a very, very important events. You need to know that coastal China at that time, these provinces, when they absorb the foreign capital, it's not paid back by themselves, because China is a kind of very, very independent financial system. Any penny of the foreign capital flow in China immediately taken by the central bank, turned to the RMB yuan against to RMB yuan. So it means that the Chinese central governments take the responsibility of the foreign capital, of the foreign debts. The foreign capital invested into any area in China immediately turn to the responsibility taken by central governments. So that is the local governments can have a faster growth, but the cost, especially the foreign investments, as the cost taken by central. So most of these people, they just see this coastal area have a booming economy. They said, okay, it's good, but they never do the studies to notice that the responsibility, the institutional cost, not taken by the local. That is why there are so many contradictions between central and local happened since 1980s. it's also very important to know that because of this overseas investments into the coastal area, so the local governments in coastal area, their policy mainly pro-foreign capital. Pro-foreign capital policy in coastal area means that they wouldn't like to set up pro-labor, pro-environment. The policy cannot be, that is a contradiction. If you set up your policy for pro-capital, especially pro-foreign capital, means that you are not pro-local capital. You are not pro to local labor, social welfare. You cannot pro the local environment. So it means that the coastal areas' booming economy have a very big cost, not taken by the coastal area. The financial capital turned to the debts taken by the central. And then they don't pay the social welfare to these migrants laborers. So the social welfare, whatever, the children, the aging people, whatever, you need to carry out of this marginalized population, the responsibility taken by the inland local governments. And also they don't care about the environments. So large amount of the pollution happened in the coastal area nowadays. So that means even they have a very fast growth, but if you do your studies, you may find there's a very complicated, very comprehensive institutional cost still happened, but not paid by coastal area. That is a so-called regional gap, not so simple. Not only the income gap, we need to know that the unbalanced, not only the economic affairs, but also the social affairs and the environmental affairs and the pollution and whatever. So many things cannot be thing of positive. It's a local industrialization also have a big institutional cost. So, and think about these two types of industrialization. Both have a very big institutional cost. So in 1980s, when this institutional cost created, finally we'll turn to the crisis. Not only economic crisis, but also the political crisis. So because the contradiction between local and the local, between central and the local, between different social groups, between different interest groups, become more and more serious. So the 1980s, a lot of people think that it's an ideological issue, but I said no, it's because of the economic growth. Inside of economic booming growth, there are many contradictions, never been analyzed by the officials and scholars. When we talk about these contradictions, we have to say something that is, in 1980s, China also renamed by Western ideology as Neoliberalism. And the Chinese leader in 1980s also renamed as the leader of Neoliberalism. Because that is just a kind of join together. Western countries move out their industries, their facilities. There must be a big one, can be market, can be the container to absorb these foreign industrial capitals. So that is a so-called international market or international institutions. So why people more interested into the neoliberalism? That's because neoliberalism not only take place in advanced country, they want to move out their physical productions and then turn their economy into high levels, into high structure. That is a financial capital era. But this financial capital era, they need to find the container to contain the institutional cost. This institutional cost turned to the China, and China, inside China, became multiple contradiction. including of central local, different interest group, and whatever. So from the 1980s, when China take large amount of foreign capital for high growth, that is a lot of people think it's a very positive experiences. Few people pay attention to the negative lessons. So my analysis very much emphasize, even you have your economical growth, you need to do some studies inside of the economic growth to notice the institutional cost. So that is this page. We are trying to do the explanation. Okay, so for the central governments almost carried out their purpose because they want to restructure the economic, they restructure the national industries. Okay, they gained this aim. So look at this one. From the 1985, it's a close, I mean, by this, from 78, started the economic reform, and the light industries grow up. And from 85, it's almost closed. And to 90, it's a half-half. So heavy industry and light industry, the structure became closed. Means originally it's a heavy industry played more than 60%. In 1950s, more than 70%. And 1970s, down to 60%. And then 1980s, so 50%. Means that the national industry structure originally is imbalanced. It's a more have a more heavy capital, heavy industries now turn to the half to half. So that is a very important. Since 1980s, a lot of people's livelihoods can be satisfied by the national industries. And this one is I mentioned is the line between Aihui and Tengchong, 70% of capital allocated in the east, and 70% of natural resources allocated in the west. And this one is talking about the coastal areas, overseas investments. We have understood the Western countries transfer out their physical industries, their manufacturing industries first. That is from 1960s to 1970s to these Asian small economies, like South Korea, like Chinese Taiwan, like Hong Kong, like Malaysia, and Philippines, and Thailand, and Singapore, and these kind. But it's too small, and small labor force. So less than 10 years, almost all of these so-called the price of productivity increased very faster, and means that these manufacturing industries in these small economies will not very effective. So they got to move. And then when they move and they enlarge their production, the best place is coastal China, because at the time I mentioned, because coastal China can absorb large amount of cheap labors from inland China. And means that these overseas Chinese factories directly move to the coastal area. But it's also very important because when they move to the coastal area, they only allocate it in Tile Delta area. Here also, that is Hong Kong and Macau. This one is Taiwan. Means that the overseas Chinese investments not parted to the whole coastal area. They only hustled in small area nearby Hong Kong because they benefited by cheap productivity price, by the low price of productivity. And if they move to some far further, they go into some inland, even in Guangdong province. If they go to the North Guangdong or West Guangdong, or they need to pay more cost of the transportation. So they only stay around Hong Kong, means that they can be easier to transfer out, to export their products to the overseas markets. So this phenomenon shows that large percentage of the so-called overseas investments from Hong Kong. Look at that. So until now, originally in 1980s, more than 90% of the Guangdong province and overseas investments from Hong Kong and Macau. Nowadays, still be 66. That is 60s nowadays. So originally more than 90s, now still be more than 60s. So these events just can prove my arguments just now I raised up. To make people understand, only take these overseas manufacturing investments cannot have the ability to create their capital. You only give the profits to these overseas investors. You have a little interest controlled by the local. So the local cannot have enough ability by the capital accumulation for upgrade their economy. That is nowadays in Guangdong province or even Zhejiang and Fujian, these coastal provinces, they have no ability to upgrade their economic structure. And even they want to change these low levels manufacturing industries, but they have these manufacturing industries has very strong relation with the local elites, with the local interest group. So up to now, even large number of the foreign, especially from Western countries, overseas investments would like to invest into China, but it's mainly invest into Shanghai or Jiangsu or Shandong or this area, not in Guangdong or Fujian. It's because of the most of this land have been occupied by low levels manufacturing industries. So you cannot just kick them out. So that is when we talk about the local industries, we need to know that there are so many things we should going forward to carry out the studies. And then we may have more experiences and lessons to show to other developing countries. But it's a big lesson. If you only can absorb these manufacturing industries for overseas market needs, means that you cannot have the local ability for capital accumulation, for set up your own national industries. Also cannot set up any ability to upgrade your economic structure. So this lesson we we took from coastal China, especially the southeast coast of China, but it may be applied to other developing countries. So it's certainly that they want to have a very fast money. These overseas investments focus on the manufacturing industries. It's faster and easier to move inside. Nowadays, like Vietnam, like Myanmar, or Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka, these countries, they are now taken a large number of the manufacturing industries from China now. Because the labor price and the environment price all goes high, so they moved to these more poor countries. These manufacturing industries only seeking the cheap labor and cheap land, because they have even no exactly interest. They only can take the revenues from this area that the local governments pro foreign capital, not pro labor, not pro environment. So they take not the interest. These manufacturing industries mainly take the profits from the revenue of social welfare, of the environmental protection. Means that if local governments didn't set up the policies to protect the labor welfare, didn't pay the expense of the social umbrella, these funds not paid by governments but shared with the local governments and these investors, these foreign investors. It's in China. It's most of these laborers, they have a generation by generation. Now the old generation has been back. Nobody gave them the pension fund. Nobody gave them the social securities. Their problems only can be solved in the inland provinces. So when we pay attention to such kind of development, we need to indicate that is not benefited the local, not benefited local, but only benefited some interest group, some local elites. It's not a kind of inclusive increase. It's exclusive. So we gave some pictures, some data here, trying to show that it's a big lesson. And here we gave you the number of the so-called labor. When China just started the reform, the labor force in China is the highest in the world. Most of these labor force to the total population, less than 50%. But China is 63.5%, because female labor join the work is the highest percent of the world. Most of these countries, female have a lot of difficulties to join the labor market. But in China, because of the land reform since 1949, and female labor released, liberalized, and so until now, so the female labor join the labor markets, China is the highest up to now. So it's caused by this one. So Chinese labor force to the total population is the highest in the world. And think about these manufacturing industries. They hired a lot of young female laborers. So that is quite different with other South Asian countries. So when we just talk about the central industrialization, local industrialization, we will find that the central local, the budget, is a change. And in the 1950s, because of the Soviet Union aid, China is mainly taken by central. So the central budget is 80% or less than 80%, 70% something. And then, because Soviet Union retreat, the central budget down to the 20%. And there in 1960s, because of the third frontier construction, central concentrate some budget power, so it's increased. And then, caused by 1970s, large number of the Western investments only taken by the central. So the central budget also increased. And then here, when we talk about the crisis, the late 1980s, the crisis happened. And then central must pay the heavy foreign debts. So the central budget decreased. Until 1994, when the tax division reform taking place, central budget and local budget half to half, up to now. So you can see that different time, different period, different policy to make the central and the local, the contradiction between central and local. We use this picture to show that the contradiction between central and local. Indeed, it's very critical. And the central always want to take more, but local always want to protect local interest. So that it's a big country, have a long-term contradiction between central and local. Here, when we talk about the late 1980s crisis taking place, it's caused by the so-called twin price system. And this twin price system created bureaucrats speculations and then turned to the high inflation. The worst situation because of these two things. What is a twin price system? Originally in rural China, the peasants sell their family products in free market. That is market price. But the governments want to take the scissors for the government's industrial accumulation. So governments gave a low price to take a part of the agricultural products. So there is a twin price. One is a farmers' market's price. Another is government's purchase price. So that is a twin price system. From 1950s until now, in agricultural society, it still be twin price system. But when the urban area want to carry out the reform, they gave the government's departments special priority. Means government's department at that time is somehow not high income. They are, government's officials' income still be very low. And also caused by the late early 1980s, large number of the urban youths have no job, including of these cadres, young children. The cadres children need to have a kind of priority. So means that from the beginning of the 1980s, the central governments gave a special priority to the government departments. Every government department can set a company. This company created the interest, contribute to the departments. And then departments officials can share such kind of interest for the subsidies of their daily life. Like even in the Central Party Committee, they have a Central Party's departments. They are not very much involved of the economic affairs. So, and I still remember in 1980s, the north part of the Zhongnanhai, it's a Middle South Sea. It's a word-to-word translation. But the north part of this central yard, surrounded by red wall, is the center of the China. North part belong to the State Council. South part belong to the Central Party Committee. The south parts, the cadres, is officials, somehow think that they are lower position than the north. Because north is a state council, they carry a lot of economic departments, means they control these economic affairs, and then they have a lot of benefits from different levels, economic affairs. But the South, they are in charge of the party affairs, not very much involved of economic affairs. So they have no such kind of benefits. So the South sometimes, especially low levels, cadre, not high levels, they can satisfy their position. And they also can have another position when they become middle age or even elder. So they may take some position in economic department. But these young cadres, they complain, we are very poor. Yes, and in the 1980s, at that time, I was a young fellow in the Central Party Committee's office for rural work and for rural policies. We have no any benefits. So even there's no dining hall in the departments. We got to go to the street to have a lunch or dinner. We are very cautious to save money, and because that time we are exactly poor. So, and when you allow these departments, even our departments, as a kind of office inside of the party committee central leadership, we also have the priority to open a taxi company. And others, anyway, you have a special rights to open a company, and then you take the benefits from the company. So when they have such kind of special rights, and these government departments, when they control the purchase price, they can move a part of these low price materials or commercial goods to their company, and then to take more benefits from the markets, and then to subsidize their officials. That is the started. But when they started by such kind of bad behavior, and then immediately turn to the corruptions, and because the more you take from your purchase price, it's a twin price system, means the more you can have the benefits from markets. So that is a lot of, at that time, a shortage of the raw materials, like iron and steel materials, like cement materials and glasses, and so even the fund. It means that they gave a part of their control, by the planning control, they still have a lot of power. So they use their power to change into the money. That is 1980s. And then who did it? Their children. So their children became, at that time, even older people have a very bad comments to such kind of corruptions. They're from 1980s. And then the people talk about Guandao. Guandao means the bureaucrats' business. So even you are official, you have your business. Your business is just take these low price materials into the markets. And then, step by step, they don't directly use this purchase price materials into the markets. No, they just give the documents how much you can have, and then these documents can be transferred one by another, even 10 times transferring, turn large amount of the profits, but make the market's price increase more faster than before, even to make very bad inflation. So the more shortage, the more high inflation, mainly caused not by so-called the marketization, it's mainly caused by the bureaucrat's business. These things, I suppose that is aroused a lot of social complaint, because finally this high inflation became the institutional cost taken by the society, by the common people. So that is also, no matter whatever you want to carry out as a reform, all turn to negative things, because these businessmen, they don't believe that you have a good policy, because they every day they facing the challenge of the corruptions. So by such kind of twin price system, created large number of the bureaucrats' speculation and the corruptions, aroused a lot of social complaint, and then turned to the high inflation. So we can see here, according to some scholars' study, in the year 1988, that is the high inflation taking place, the total amount of the price difference is 350.9 billion Chinese yuan. It's almost 30% of the total income, of the whole national income. And it's also bigger than the total savings in the bank system. Means that large number of the profits lost by such kind of system. And then not only for these speculators, these bureaucrats, corruptions, they take large benefits, but also make the high inflation. You can see that here is high inflation. Since the reform, there are 2 times high inflation. One is 1988 to 1989, and then 1990 is down to the bottom. And then second time is 1993, 1994. So that's all. These are 2 crises, close, very close. And this one, I said the high inflation mainly caused by the bureaucrats' speculation. And also, we need to give another events, and then to help you to do the analysis. Local industrialization also need large amount of the raw materials. Rural industrialization have never been calculated by the planning system. So the local industrialization, some of them allocated in the coastal area, they can input raw materials and then export manufactured products. They can at least make some balance. But it's a rural industrialization under the county level, developed very fast, but never been calculated by the planning system. Only one way is trying to take the raw materials and the bank loans, the funds, by some measures. I remember in 1980s, and some local people trying to send the gift to Beijing to some government departments. But Beijing, the streets is very complicated and traffic also bad. So they don't know how to drive into Beijing. So at that time in 1980s, I helped them to be a pilot, to give them the way how to find the government departments. Also at that time, there's not so concentrate. I mean, the whole of the officials, whole of the employees in the government departments, they can share similar benefits. Even you are a minister, you only have some, maybe a blanket of the eggs, because local, especially these rural factories, they send a lot of fresh agricultural products or some local products. They may send you some clothes and some curtains or some pork or some eggs. It's a big truck, drive to the government department's yard, and you can share equally. But just several years later, they changed. They don't need to drive the truck into Beijing. It's too much highway. They just go to send to the key person, to send gift to the key persons, and then the corruptions concentrate to some small group. That is late 1980s. So the order, the regulation, little bit change, but it's a very bad impact the official system. And so that is but most of them, you can just take their position. You can just imagine if you are them, what you are trying to do as a change. They said, okay, we can do some change. Yes, they did. They did is what? Is that the so-called the price reform, to marketize all the price. But it's immediately when they just have a discussion in the political bureau, trying to issue a new reform, means marketize all the price. Immediately turn to the social chaos. In 1988, in May of 1988, 抢购, how to say that? 抢购, you know, means the mass people hustled in the store to buy whatever they can buy, because they all worry about inflation, and they suffered a lot about such kind of speculation turned to the inflation. So if the store gave some commercial goods, they will immediately hustled to take it. So make these stores cannot open the door. They just open little, and then to whatever you want to buy, you give me money and then give you the commercial goods. So this pictures to show that people hustled in the counter in the store to trying to buy even they don't need. They buy a lot of things, store in their home, and many decades they still be there. And like the clothes, or the how to say that, 肥皂, 洗衣粉, powder of the washing machine, or the what it's anyway, they buy a lot of daily life used commercial goods, and that is when the central just begin to discuss. They said, okay, we can marketize all the raw materials and the goods and whatever, means that marketization. When they want to adopt the reform policy towards marketization. You can compare with Soviet Union, other East European countries. No matter where or whenever and wherever, when they trying to exactly to move the marketization as institutions into their country, almost all of them aroused a lot of trouble, even the big chaos. China did earlier. So in late 1980s, not only China, but also East European countries and Soviet Union all believe marketization, all believe free market system. So when they started, a lot of social chaos happened. Here is also. And then when they are dissatisfied, they go to strike and campaign. Here is a down with bureaucrats business, and also it's down with bureaucrats. It's even the young kids. I think it's pupils in the school. They go to street because they also suffered of high inflation. So and then finally turn to the 89 political movements in Tiananmen Square. Here also anti-corruption in name of ceremony of Huyaobang. But it's one flag have a two slogan. This one is in name of Huyaobang. Because Huyaobang at that time is somehow not corruption. And another side is anti-bureaucrats and also anti the corruptions. So these put these pictures together, you can find that even the policemen at that time shows their agreement to the social campaign. That is protesting to anti the corruption, anti the high inflation. So the high inflation make the people, the common people, very much cautious of their daily life. So they join the mass buying things, the mass hustled in the store, one by another time. So several times happening. But here, the mainstream officials still insist on such kind of marketization. That's a policy. So not only in May, they started for discussion, they make decision, and then arouse the social chaos. And then in later, in the June and July and August, they insist such kind of policy, and then to make more people, to make nationwide mass, not fighting, the mass buying. People hustled to the store to buy whatever. And because of people all go to the store to buy the commercial goods, and then the price increased more faster than before. And also this bureaucrats business, they take this chance because it's historical chance. It's market price much high, and then this purchase price much low. So if they are the businessmen, they must take this benefits. So means that the more inflation, the more the bureaucrats business do the speculations. That make the late 1988, early 1989, the social chaos everywhere. So not only the Tiananmen Square, but also a lot of people join the local campaign. So when we have such kind of economic crisis, we must know that the mainstream policy designer made they did need to have measures, but measures make the furthermore crisis. Because the first, because of the high inflation, and the people go to the bank to take the savings to buy the commercial goods. And then the bank will be bankrupted. If you have too much people take the savings out of the bank, and then bank will have no money to give the loan to the industries and the commercial things, events. So that is the leader first give up the price reform. Originally, they have a very strong mind to marketize the old price, but from the late August, the leader refused. Gave up this reform. And then the same time, they take a kind of special policy for maintain your savings interest. The saving interest, not only the bank gave the public to publish the savings interest, but also according to the inflation. How much inflation, and the government subsidize. The bank subsidize your savings interest. And because that time the inflation increased to more than 15%. So if you savings is maybe 5% as an interest rate, but you can meanwhile have another 15%. Means that your saving rates can be 20%. 20% saving rates. How much as a loan? The bank rate. If you give a loan, you pay the saving interest 20%. You need at least 5% as a bank cost. So means that if you increase the saving rate, you must increase the loan rates. But the government only increase the saving rates, not increase the bank rates. And then you can guess what happened. The first, bank did have the chance to do the seeking rents, rent seeking, because there is a big gap between savings and the loans. Means the loans need to have everybody want to have a loan, you need to pay at least 25. But because you only pay maybe 70, the 7 or 8, originally because the saving rate is only 5, and then loan rate is only 7. So it's a 50% as a bank cost. But nowadays the saving rates increase to the 20%, but the loan rates still remain 7%. Means that these employees in the bank, they can negotiate. You pay more than 7, maybe 15, but you still have a large profit. But another one, so some people calculated this minus interest rate every year, annually, maybe more than 300 billion. But bank itself have no such kind of 300 billion. This large amount of the benefits lost. That is the first problem. Means that you have a minus interest rate because you paid more to these savings. You got less from the loans. So that is the first. But officially, immediately turn to the second very negative event, that is all bank have a large deficit. The bank have a deficit, bank belong to the government at that time. In late 80s and early 90s, all the bank, there's no private one. So the bank is the government's hands. So the governments immediately take all the bank deficit into the budget deficit. So the late 1980s, December, the government's budget deficit increased more faster than before. So also means that the governments have no ability to invest into the industrialization. It also means a large number of the employees have no job. So in the 1989, caused by the high inflation and also caused by the government measures, in 1989, immediately turned to the social conflicts. It's a very popular regulation. Any ism, any institution, if you're facing the challenge of the high inflation, you need to take some measures. Most of these government measures made negative impact. That is unemployment increased. So in 89, because of the governments have a very big deficit, short of the investments ability, so in 89 started unemployment problem. And also because of the governments got to increase the bank rate for the loans. So in 1989, a lot of business in reality, they don't take the bank loan. Like these stores. These business, they need to take the bank loan and then to buy the products from the factory and then sell these products from the factory. They sell the products and then pay back to the bank. That is a cycle. But these stores, these shopping centers, they said to the upstream, to these factories, they said, okay, I can sell your products, but I cannot pay your money because money is too much high price. So I have no fund. You can give me your products, and then I sell for you. And that means that this shopping center need they owe these factories, but they need to pay the salaries to their employees, so they never reduce any fees. The costs still be there. So the whole of the economic system became chaos. And then this 连锁负债 means that the debts became a kind of chains. And because the factory produce these products, need to pay the machines to the upper stream factory. They have no money, so they said, okay, I owe you. But wait, the whole of the industrial chains became a kind of death chain. That is in 1989 and until 1990. So that means that the whole of the industrial segment cannot run because whole of this cycle stopped, caused by the financial capital problem. So that's the real economic crisis taking place, caused by the leaders trying to follow the neoliberalism to marketize the whole of the economy. And then they're facing the challenge, they have no applied measures for preparation. They only think that, okay, we're going on with the path of the market system. That is the only right way. But when they're trying to adopt these measures, they immediately facing a lot of big problems. And then also turn to the social chaos. And then at that time, because I think that most of these senior leader, they have no exactly the knowledge about what is the economic crisis, and they also have knowledge to know that the economic crisis must turn to the social problems. So they think that is an ideological issue. So they made some political measures to try to price the so-called capitalist mental pollution. They gave a lot of new concept to describe such kind of social problems. They said it's because of your impact by the capitalist ideology, or they may think that you are trying to do some bad things to involve of the stability. So they have done some measures. So that is why it's a turn to the Tiananmen political events and then priced by the governments. So that is the 1980s. It's a very clear picture up now. We can tell you that what is originally happened, and then step by step turn to the economic contradiction between central and local and the local. And then this contradiction cannot be solved, and because unbalance, the gap is aroused the local trouble, and also because of this local industrialization grow up faster to make short of the raw materials supply, and then the raw material supply need to control by the governments, and the governments allow some part of the raw materials out of the purchase price became market price. That is twin price system. Twin price system turned to this bureaucrats business to be the speculations player, and then they make more high inflation. And then high inflation turned to the social campaign, social protest. And then social protest in name of some politicians' ceremony. That's because these are not applied to the so-called political correct at that time. So it's a many complicated situation. We can just clean up from the economic development. And then finally we found out that is just a regulation. Economic crisis turned to the social conflicts. So in the late 1980s, when China have such kind of Tiananmen Square movements and priced by governments, and then immediately got the American reaction. So the American reaction is just the 1 day later. So June 4th, there's a government's priced the Tiananmen movements. June 5th, the American president stopped the military collaborations, and then American followed their measures of barrel China and block China economically, and also announced and asked other American-controlled international organization like World Bank or IMF stopped investing in China. And I remember that in late 1980s, I was a member of the Chinese group to facilitate World Bank transition loan, help China to transit from the planning system into market system. And that's what can maintain, because it's for transition, ideologically. Others, any international organization invested in China for development, all stopped. So that stop means that China in late 1989, early 1990s, got to facing the new challenge of shortage of foreign capital. Originally, you have a large amount of foreign capital flow into China, and then you can readjust your national industries, restructure, readjustment. You can do a lot of things by this foreign capital flow in, and then you can make the balance between light industry and heavy industry, whatever you can do. But this time, when they stopped, similar as when Soviet Union stopped the investments into China as a kind of government assistant. So that is immediately make China to have the economic crisis in the year 1960. But this time, in 1990, immediately China falling into the depression because of Western countries stopped gave the foreign capital into China. But at that time, it's just a capital-intensive growth. No matter you develop these local industries, or no matter you readjust your national industries, you all need the followed the capital investments. So that is a capital-intensive growth. But when Western capital stopped, and then domestic capital also that I just mentioned the domestic bank at that time all have a very big deficit. So domestic bank cannot work well, and overseas capital stopped. So make China have a depression. That is in late 1989 and 1990. So this time, when China trying to set up the relinking relationship with Western countries, since 1970 to 1980s, China have almost 20 years this time from Mao. In 1960, delinking. 11 years or 12 years passed. From 1971, 1972, China started relinking with the Western capital investment, with the Western technical aid, whatever. And then, when you have the Western facilities, you need to use the Western management system. That is started the economic reform. And then more open to any kind of the Western investments. That is from the beginning of late 1970, early 1980s. Means that Mao started the relinking, and then Deng fully relinking. Any kind of foreign investments can directly settle in China. So they said we are linking with international system. That means that relinking became a very popular event in 1970 to 1980s, and not along 2 decades. From 72 started to import the foreign facilities until 88, 89. Means that China has 16 years to 17 years relinking to West. It is extremely important, not only to China, how to remember the historical lessons, but also to any other developing countries. If you do want to relinking, you need to take the Chinese lessons as into your consideration. You cannot only take a look to notice that China have a high growth. China fulfilled the industrialization. You also need to know how China paid the cost. How many times crisis happened in China? When China restarted the linking with the Western capital since 70 to 80s. So this time, when we talk about that, we got to say that when American this time try to block China, it's not so long. You know that from 1950, because of the Korean War, American lead other Western countries block China until 72, 71. So this is 21 years. This time, from 89 to 93, American gave up. It's because most of these Western countries did have their interest in this biggest market, that is China. So they cannot follow American. And even that time, some of these Western countries keep investing into China. So that is American cannot stop. They just suggest. Also, they can control this international organization, but they cannot stop other countries keep invest into China. Even it's small, but it still be there. So not keep longer, just 4 years or 3.5 years. It's changed. So, but when we see that curves, we can see that it's very smoothly. But here, you can see that high growth in 84, 85, and then downgrade. Or from 88 to 89. This 88, this 89. Decreased to only 4%. Originally, it's more than 10%. And then down to later, not minus, but less than 4%. This one is so these are 2 years. The crisis happened very serious. And you also can see that because of this is external debt, short term to the normal GDP. Because of 1989, the foreign capital stopped flow in China. So these short-term external debts also decreased to the GDP. So many things happened in the late 1980s. And we got to give the final conclusion about this one. That is to calculate into the whole of the 10 crises. This time, the late 1980s, is the sixth. The sixth crisis is the first stagflation crisis caused by the first time by marketization. Means that first time marketization in China in 1980s and encountered the stagflation. And that is a stagflation is a kind of economic crisis type. You can be easier to learn from Marxism. But in China, few people talk about stagflation because they don't think that it's a kind of economic crisis. But it's indeed. We said positive experiences is that the country, the state, passed from the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. They passed 3 decades. Finally, they gained the purpose to make the balance between heavy industry and light industries. So from late 80s to early 90s, China have a very rich light industrial, tax industrial products. The people's livelihoods much improved. But that not only created by 1980s. It started by 1960s and 70s. 60s and 70s, they have paid very high cost. Until 80s, they can realize the purpose for the balance of the industrial structure. Heavy, light, make balance. That is one country want to make your industries sustainability. Industrial sustainability need to have the markets. The heavy industry contribute the facilities, the machines to light industry. Light industry contribute the commercial goods to the markets. Finally, China realized such kind of sustainable industrialization, but paid very much high cost. Until 1990s, China still paid a high cost. I will give such kind of explanation in later when we talk about the seventh and the eighth crisis. We will give more detailed. It's because involve of 45 million state-owned enterprises employees lay off. That's the biggest cost in the world. But when we talk about the crisis, we must see that this crisis, the reason of the crisis mainly come from the external issues because of relinking. First, that is China utilized the foreign capital, reform its structure of the national industries. I have mentioned several times before this explanation about the sixth crisis. I said any penny of the foreign investments into the developing country immediately turn to the foreign debts. If you have money, pay back. If you have money, you don't need to have a foreign capital investment. Because most of these developing countries want to set up the modernization by industrialization and urbanization. Both of these industrialization and urbanization all have capital intensive as a mechanism inside. So if you are short of the capital, you must take the capital from our overseas. And then overseas capital flow into your country, turn to the debts. And then debts make the deficit. And the deficits make the crisis. So it means that external issues still be very important events to understand what happened in 1980s. And then the local governments started local industrialization mainly from the 1980s. Local industrialization got the rootless investments from overseas Chinese. As I mentioned in Guangdong, Palo Delta area, more than 90% of the overseas investments come from Hong Kong and Macau. Many come from Hong Kong. So these are rootless investments only seeking the social revenue and the environmental revenue, cannot create large amount of the interest. No interest means that no ability for the local capital accumulation. And then means that local have a very important shortage for readjust the local economic structure. That is from the 1980s to nowadays, almost 40 years in coastal China. The local governments still feel very difficult to readjust the local economic structure. They cannot have a high-tech industries. They cannot have a heavy industries. They cannot have a machinery industries. Nowadays, still be a kind of manufacturing industries play important role. So that is why when these manufacturing industries move out to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, there is a kind of local worrying, especially the governments, because that these laborers will have no job. And also when they have destroyed the local environments, if they move out, you will have no tax to protect your environment problems, to solve the problems. So that is a very important negative impact. Another one is that when they input the facilities, means that the upstream industry, national industries, cannot supply the machines to these coastal area manufacturing industries. Means that they cut down the market relation. So make the national industries become more and more falling into the trap. Finally, they got to be bankrupted. So when we talk about such kind of problems. We need to know that the national industrial capitals originally is their products is shortage. We have a shortage economics. But after 1980s, few manufacturing economy for overseas demand need the national industries to produce machines to facilitate the manufacturing industries in coastal area. So this one, I said, is also very important. Even they can short terms to create some tax or can have this foreign reserve. They can have the trade surplus. Nowadays, China became a trade surplus country, mainly by the coastal area. But that is a return. But you also need to think about the cost. So here is the cost. And the external issues also including of this American bloc China, that's from 1989. Because that you rely on foreign investments. So when you have the conflicts with United States, political conflicts, they stopped foreign investments into China, and then you immediately fall into the trap of the deficit, means reserve deficit. And we will give you more explanation about next crisis. When we talk about the seventh crisis, we will tell you how much is a foreign reserve debt and how it's impact the Chinese economic growth. And then we can turn to the internal issues. The internal issues, the first is because of the 1949. The urban economy started to use the twin price system. Originally, this system only applied to the rural China, not applied to urban China. But when they trying to take this one as a positive experience into the urban reform, they found that it's applied to this bureaucrat's business. This bureaucrat's business, the big benefits, more than 300 billion annually. I mean, in 1988. 1988 is the worst year of the bureaucrats' business because they took too much and make the highest inflation. Up to now, the data has been readjusted. Originally, in 1980s, the governments committed the high inflation is 18.6%. And now it's readjusted down to the 15%. But 15 is also very high because nowadays a lot of countries like China only have a 3% or less than 3% inflation. But at that time, it's 18%, 18.6. So it's high, very high inflation. And in this year, because of the high inflation happened, and the government's mainstream officials and scholars, they had designed a kind of reform plan or reform project. I said it's similar in most of these East European countries, including of Soviet Union. In China, it's when they utilize such kind of reform projects, when they try to utilize, they just make the pre-decision, because all the decisions need to be made in political bureau, and then give such kind of decision as a suggestion to the State Council. There is a very complicated the system, not exactly taught by these State Council's economic department. No, first it's in the State Bureau. But there's many information channels. So when they just gave such kind of decision, in May, a lot of people have information. So there is a kind of social problems happen. And when finally the Beidaihe conference, the Beidaihe is not formal, but it's a kind of informal closed meetings. When these senior politicians all agree with such kind of suggestion, May they have suggestions. And then in August, July and August, when these senior politicians settled in Beidaihe, enjoy their so-called vacation, and they can have many different closed-door meetings, and then they get discuss, like a lobby, something, and then they make decision. They support this reform, and when they just give such kind of information, immediately the social problem aroused again. So these are things. I mean, you can see negative, but you also can it's a positive, because these are things to make the central politician, these are senior persons, seeing that it's a too much negative things happen. So they immediately make decision, stop. So the 30th of April, of August, the State Council make a decision, stop such kind of reform. But the bad impact has been expanded to anywhere. So a nationwide fighting for buying things, not fighting, but trying to compete to buying commercial goods has been, you cannot stop. So that is to benefit China, stop the marketization and leave this chance to East European countries and the Soviet Union. I said in 1988, almost all of these countries, sponsored by World Bank, all have the similar projects, turn their planning system into the market system. But China stopped in the summer of 1988. Others, no. They are maybe their people is somehow more polite or more cultural qualities, some high, whatever. But they have no such kind of trying to buy commercial goods, these social kiosks, they don't have. And means that they still keep going. And then these countries all bankrupted. So I said that the heaven bless China by a crisis to give enough lessons to both upper leaders and lower societies to prevent China from a corruption, from a collapse. So even from that time, from 89, almost all the Western media, ideology, all announced China will be collapsed. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe next month. But from that time, China still be there, not collapse. I said it's a big lesson, late 80s, caused by the first time China trying to marketize. Gave the big lesson, make China stop, and then be cautious to going forward step by step. Even by the sixth crisis, not still not be enough lesson. So China need to have another one. That is the seventh lesson. Maybe to make China aware this is not exactly the right way. We need to take more cautious. We need to be more cautious to going forward. So that is when we talk about this one, we have to think about what is lessons China take. And then when we talk about the measures dealing with the crisis, we found that it's the first to make the state bank system fall into the big trap that is a big deficit. It's the first financial crisis, but not be happened, but be controlled. That is also very important issue we need to take into the consideration to think about. At that time, I mean, in the year 1988, all Chinese banks need to be bankrupted because all have a very bad deficit. As I know, because at that time I was a policy researcher in Central. As I know, the December, by the statistic, the whole bank system have more than 59 billion, 59 or 58, 58 or 59 billion as a deficit. So the total savings is 300 billion. And also at that time, there's no Basel commitment. China not follow the Basel commitment. But anyway, think about the total savings, 300 billion. The total deficit is more than near to be 50 billion. That means that 1/6 of the bank assets has been gone. So it's much, much bigger than the Basel. The Basel gave you this 8%. So at that time, people need to think about why Chinese bank system didn't bankrupt it. It's because at that time, the bank system and the budget system close together. It's the one government's two hands. So when governments have very serious deficit in the bank system, governments can put this bank deficit into the budget deficit because there's no separation. So together. So only this country can have such kind of mechanism to solve the bank system's problem, immediately to solve by the budget system. So the government's fiscal take the whole of this bank deficit into the budget, and then to make the budget deficit increase to 50 billion. That is the December of 1988, how Chinese governments solved the big bank deficit. It's a market system or not? I leave this question to all the audience. You can think about that. How you maintain the key sector of your economic department system. The sixth sector is financial sector. In the 1980s, when the whole Western countries, in name of Neoliberalism, to reduce any borrow, to eliminate the borrow, to make the financial capital flow free in and out. You can find that there is a country like China still control the physical system and the financial system, put them, not separation, put them together. And then at that time, it's a very critical problem, but very easy to solve by this one body, two hands, and not separation. So they can put these two hands together, and then for the macro readjustment. But the bank system can handle the problems, but the enterprises cannot. Caused by the interest rate of the loan increased in 1989, immediately turned to the death chain, as I mentioned just now. The death chain make almost all of its real production, the industries, fallen into the big crisis. And then the whole economy falling into the depression. So I said, if we see this government's measures, something maybe you can think is a positive, but something you can think that is a negative. So we just are very objective to do our analysis, to know that what indeed happened in 1980s. And then we may have basic understanding of so-called Chinese reform, so-called emerging market country like China. Okay, I finish this lecture. Hope you have a more deep discussion about 1980s in China, the crisis in China. Thank you.